I know a number of people will join us later today, but we've got a full program and we're already behind. Welcome to Day 2 of the conference Stalin Revisited, the Establishment of Communist Regimes in East Central Europe and the Dynamics of the Soviet Bloc. I'm Cristian. I direct the Center's History and Public Policy program, and on behalf of Lee Hamilton and the Center's staff, I'd like to welcome all of you here to the Wilson Center. Many of you are familiar with the Center, but some of you are not, so let me just reiterate quickly that the Center is the official U.S. memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States, as both a distinguished scholar, the only American president with a PhD, and a national leader. Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. Here at the Center, we commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson by providing a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy. By fostering research, study, discussion, and collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and scholarship in national and world affairs. Directed by former Congressman Lee Hamilton, the Center hosts about 150 to 200 scholars annually and sponsors over 700 meetings on national and international affairs annually. The Center's History and Public Policy program seeks to provide historical context to current public policy issues, to provide a forum for the discussion of new and significant and policy-relevant historical findings and publications. Many of you are most familiar with our Cold War International History project, established at the Center in 1991, so some 16 years ago. The Cold War project serves as a clearinghouse for new evidence from what we used to call in this country the other side of the Cold War. Since 1991, the project has focused on obtaining and publishing, translating and publishing new documentation from the East Bloc archives, in particular the Russian and Eastern European archives. That was really our focus for much of the 1990s, and more recently from the Chinese, other Asian archives on the Cold War. We also host on a regular basis conferences and workshops. Lately have focused in many ways on a special kind of conference, what we call critical oral history conferences, that try to bring former policymakers, policy and veterans of the policy and diplomatic process, together with a few scholars and lots of documents, engage them in a dynamic, interactive discussion to fill the white spots in between all the documents that we're dealing with. The project has also hosted a small fellowship program and continues to host scholars here at the Center working on Cold War history. I'd like to point out in particular the project's Romania initiative, coordinated by Mircea Munteanu, the project's associate, which for a number of years has focused attention on the Romanian archives and tried to bring new evidence from the archives into the larger discussion about the Cold War. And so we're delighted to host this conference here today. Let me also point out another initiative, ongoing activity by the project that relates to this conference. That is our Stalin project, launched in 1999, almost a decade ago, at a conference at Yale University, co-organized with John Gaddis, the founding father of this project. And over the last decade or so, we have collected steadily conversations involving Stalin and foreign leaders. And over the years, we have amassed I think close to 200 conversations from archives around the world, transcripts and other documents. It's this pile of conversations, and we're hoping to publish these very soon, and perhaps there will be a contribution to the larger discussion that this conference is also fostering. Let me say in conclusion, thanks to the co-organizers. We really have played a very, very minimal role in this. All the credit should go especially to the Romanian Cultural Institute, the Romanian Embassy, to the University of Maryland, in particular Vlad Tismaneanu, who's been a longtime friend of the Wilson Center, and also Georgetown's Center for European and Russian Studies. Let me in particular thank Bogdan, Iacob, and Mircea Munteanu, and Tim McDonnell, Mircea and Tim on my staff, who have helped put this meeting together. We're delighted to have all of you here with us for the day. I wish us stimulating discussions. And with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Tismaneanu and Dr. Jowitt for the keynote session. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'll be extremely brief. Thank you, Cristian. Thank you, Mircea. Thanks, Congressman Hamilton and all our friends at the Wilson Center to be here, to have hosted the second day of this very important event, I think, both scholarly and in a general moral approach to whatever the Stalinism in East Central Europe has been about or was about. It is my real distinct and unmitigated pleasure to introduce here for the second keynote address of this conference on Stalinism in East Central Europe, Professor Ken Jowitt. I'll say just a few words because I think that on the list of people who have played an important role in my intellectual formation, I'll speak for myself and for a group of people who happen to be here from Romania. And I know that the same thing could be said by friends of ours from Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and many other places where the ideas introduced by Ken Jowitt in the 1970s, 1980s, and especially the 1990s, and currently have been followed with great attention and with a very important impact. I also speak for a number of our friends in the American political science community and historical community, where, again, Ken Jowitt's ideas have been so influential. The result of this is not just hyper type of conversation here. There's absolutely no reason to emphasize Jowitt's decisive role in understanding the role of ideology, the role of Leninism, the role of what he described and analyzed as the charismatic impersonalism of Leninist formations before and sometimes at odds with other people who did not pay attention to this particular dimension for the whole organization, or if you want, for the whole chaos of the world, you know, the bipolar world, and especially for the post-bipolar world that we live in. So as a testimony to that, I can just mention for the impact of Ken Jowitt's ideas on understanding communist political cultures, the role of personalities, the role of institutions, etc. I'm not going to go here into, I've done it in other places. There's a whole volume that was conceived as a recognition of Ken Jowitt's path-breaking contributions, and I'm not, again, engaging in any kind of hyperbolic talk. The volume came out last year from the University of Washington Press and was co-edited by Mark Howard, a student of Ken Jowitt, Rudra Sil, Mark Howard, currently at Georgetown University, who, by the way, sent me a note that he's out of the country, that he would have been extremely pleased to be here with his mentor and to participate in our conference. Rudy Sil from University of Pennsylvania, and has contributions from Barbara Geddes to Gail Kligman, Catherine Verdery, and I can go on and on. And I was also co-editor of that volume, so it's called World Order After Leninism, and it's really, I think, one of the best books that deals with these particular issues. Among the great contributions of Ken Jowitt, I'll mention here two books, and they are both of them were very influential. The first one came out in the 1970s, late 1970s, if I'm not wrong, and it's called Revolutionary Breakthroughs and National Development. And it's the case of Romania, but it's an excellent, I always give it as an example for my students whenever I serve on dissertation committees, that it is possible to write comparative politics and political theory at its best if you have just one case. This is, those who study political science know that sometimes in comp exams you are asked about the number of cases, how many cases do you need, how can comparison work? And it can work if there is the intellectual power there and the conceptual energy, and this is what Ken Jowitt is about: great conceptual power, great intellectual energy. Okay, so this is a book that can be discussed and should be discussed because it shows a revolutionary approach to revolutionary breakthroughs at a time when very few people understood the meaning of these concepts. The second book that Alan Ryan, in the pages of the Times Literary Supplement, described as one of the best social science books that have appeared in decades, and who knows Alan Ryan, he's not inclined to superlatives, is called New World Disorder. It is, in my view, it remains at this moment and after 10, 15 years, the enduring power of a book. It's clearly, if the book is still very appealing to us, very provocative, and it is still very provocative and very appealing. So we deal with a person who has meditated, who has reflected on the fate of Leninism, the fate of Stalinism, from a very original perspective, which is fundamentally, if I understand Ken Jowitt's general philosophical approach, is in many respects a neo-Weberian approach. Ken Jowitt is, for me, a model of simultaneously a great political theorist, a great comparativist, and a great public intellectual. In this respect, that's in full humility, I consider him a model for me and a model for many of my friends, as I said, in East Central Europe. The fact that Ken Jowitt does not limit itself in any way or by any stretch of the imagination to one particular country, be it Romania or any other one. Just read his introduction to the book Letters from Freedom by Adam Michnik, that came out a few years ago from the University of California Press. Jowitt's ideas are very influential also in Poland, in Hungary, and other countries. There are people who really, probably one of the most influential concepts that, together with Andrew Walder from Stanford University, Ken Jowitt has developed is the concept of neo-traditionalism. It is a very important contribution to political theory and to comparative politics. Altogether, I think that we are very privileged here in this conference, and obviously for the volume that we'll do our best to publish based on this conference, to have Ken Jowitt, to have him accepted to come from California and share with us his reflections on whatever Stalinism meant for East Central Europe, whatever the consequences, the implications, and the motivations for the Stalinist experience were. Ken, thank you very much for doing this for us, and I welcome you.
I haven't had such an introduction since my mother introduced me at a high school fete, but I will preface this with a couple of things. 3, I like the number 3. I think if you're Christian, 3 should be the types of arguments you make. Jews and Muslims are really monotheists, so they should have one argument for everything. But Christians cheat, we say there's 3 in 1. I've never understood that. So in the 4th grade, I asked Sister Consolata, how does this work? She said, it doesn't, just believe it. And so that was the extent of Catholic critical thought in my upbringing. The second thing is, when you've worked in a field for 40 years, it's nice to know you've had some recognition and some dear people associated with you. And I've had both, and I'm grateful. The third thing is, I hope I don't disappoint you with this talk, because I've given talks for 40 years, and this is the first one with a fever, with an upset stomach, with perspiration, and with a doctor telling me I shouldn't have come. So I beg your indulgence and hope the argument will overcome my feeble state. I was asked to talk about revolutionary breakthroughs, and so I'm going to do that, probably at length, maybe too great length, but then drink less coffee. According to Franz Schumann, who was a great scholar of Chinese ideology and organization, a revolutionary breakthrough means a return to the status quo ante is impossible. That's what revolutions do. The old guys don't come back. Otto Kirchheimer, in a seminal piece, Confining Conditions and Revolutionary Breakthroughs, added that a revolutionary breakthrough may occur with the old data, that is to say, pre-revolutionary elements, still remaining in the society, though absorbed in a new context and thereby deprived of its confining nature. And I think that is a brilliant insight. Revolutions, like all political change, are partial. Some are decisive. And that means that the old data, whether it be kings or armies or political parties, they may exist in some form, but they lose their decisive power. The questions then are, what were the old data, the confining conditions, and the status quo in East Central Europe that confronted its Stalinist rulers in the late 1940s, and what were the character-defining features and consequences of revolutionary breakthroughs? In short, what confronted Stalinists, and what did they bring to bear? Now, to begin with, you have to respect the substantial differences between the features of the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires. One could spend endless hours arguing over those, and as more likely would be the case, invidiously contrasting the positive features of the first to the negative features of the second. And that goes on forever and ever, and I find it's worthless. I don't think there's any question that the differences are real and significant, but indecisive. For my purposes, I'm going to emphasize the similarities between the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman. Both empires, along with the Russians, emphasize collective, not individual identity, hierarchy more than association, and political domination, not integration. More specifically, the East European area was a composite of the following: of monarchies, by no means in every country, but where they existed, typically imported in a neo-colonial manner. It was always nice to have a German prince be your king. Of armies, in most cases ineffectively controlled by civilian governments, of governments whose main reference was themselves, the reason being that publics were either absent in these countries or disorganized to the point of being easily manipulated. Of ethnic groups who occupied particular niches, some privileged, some pariahs, in an ethnic division of labor, and of course by peasants, sacks of potatoes, in Marx's vivid imagery, subject to taxation, conscription, and coercion, and these peasants were the ones who made up the quasi-national social ghetto in each country. And that's what they were. They were ghetto elements. And of course, each country in the area borrowed status from outside of its own culture, typically from Western Europe, not always, but typically from France and Germany. Now, for a polytheist, that is to say, a historian or a nationalist, whether it be Hungarian, Czech, or Polish, this characterization, emphasizing the similarities, is slightly offensive. I don't really care. I've chosen to be a monotheist because I see the entire area as having more rather than less in common. By 1948, Stalin accomplished something utterly remarkable. He established a set of geographically contiguous replica regimes next to the Soviet Union. he successfully imposed an authoritative, domineering format that disregarded the specificity of each of these countries. I conceive of the format he imposed as a castle regime. And I like the image of a castle. A castle has three defining features: distance, difference, and dominance. Distance, have you ever seen a castle? They're usually not next to a pharmacy. They're usually set up somewhere on a hill. They're different. They're a collection of power. They're not the Red Cross, and they're dominant. And that's the reason they're up there, is to dominate, not to integrate society. They're not interested in legitimating the new power. They're interested in legitimating the new inhabitants of the castle in opposition to those they don't want legitimacy from. They don't want premature reconciliation with peasants and bourgeois parties and Romanian Orthodox churches or Catholics. They don't want them. They're seen as potential and genuine sources of contamination, of deviation from a revolutionary purpose. Well, East European Stalinist regimes created political moats between themselves and their societies. They distanced themselves from those societies by use of political violence of a very specific type: terror. Unpredictable, intense, arbitrary, destructive. Each regime established a difference between itself and its society by its privileges. It monopolized privileges and access to goods, and by its identification with the Soviet Union prior to identification with its society. The amazing thing is these regimes were not primarily concerned with being popular. They did not care about being popular. To be popular was to reconcile yourself with the old data, with the confining conditions, with the forces that you wanted to transform. And so distance was crucial. And they distanced themselves in part by looking at the Soviet Union rather than their own societies. The Soviet Union became their point of legitimation, not their own societies. It even got carried to the point, this element of difference, that many communists in Eastern Europe went out of their way to marry Russian wives. Romanians would leave out the vowels in the words they spoke, so it sounded more Slavic. I mean, it was an extraordinary event that this was an area filled with differences that minimized those differences, not only due to the imperative of Soviet role, but because these communist parties, A, were weak, and B, didn't want to be national. They did not want to be national. Yes, Yugoslavia wanted to be national, right. There's exceptions to every rule. It wasn't an important one. Ended up forming a third world which amounted to nothing and never even got a name, just had a number. What you saw here was the replication of a Stalinist regime in which you had distance created by terror, difference created by privilege and identification with the Soviet Union, and dominance through the secret police. And it was quite clear. That distance, difference, and difference, I can remember walking in Budapest, in Bucharest, and having friends cross the street when they came to a certain building and then cross back over. I said, what the hell is that about? I mean, what kind of detour do you make when there's no signs? And they said it's a security tatya, and there was a fear you just get grabbed in. This was a real psychological dimension to what this pattern of rule meant. The most unique exception to this pattern was Poland. Poland stands out as the England of Eastern Europe. And by far the most important element of Poland's uniqueness is something that people typically disregard. Yes, they didn't collectivize the peasants. Yes, they didn't fully bust the Roman Catholic Church. The most unique feature of Poland was that in 46 and 47, when they took over the Western territories from the Germans, 5 to 7 young, unmarried males who were tough, people you wouldn't like to meet. They went in and they inhabited those territories, and they inhabited them before the Communist Party and the Roman Catholic Church were able to establish dominance. And it is no mere accident that the site and the origin of solidarity is the Western territories. That, more than anything else, created a civic base that Poland alone enjoyed. Now, what did this Stalinist castle, with its distance, difference, and dominance, what did it achieve? Am I saying something confusing? What did it achieve? Well, the first thing it did was eliminate monarchies. It then subverted the professional integrity of militaries. It subordinated or eliminated the historical political parties, and with one exception, the Roman Catholic Church. Collectivization, which I regard as the signature feature of Stalinist rule, not industrialization. Collectivization is what distinguished Stalinism everywhere. And what Stalinism did was mash the peasant sack of potatoes. Just mashed it, destroyed that entity, which was the social and the cultural, the psychological and the religious basis of those societies. It thoroughly destroyed them, except in certain countries, one or two. Institutionally, and I can't emphasize this enough, institutionally, the most consequential feature of the Stalinist breakthroughs was to destroy whatever nascent public domains existed and to effectively conflate those political domains with the state and the party. The unique feature of political rule under Stalinism and under communism was to undermine, subordinate both state and public and include it within the party. So that when people talk about state socialism, it's utterly ridiculous. There was no state and there was no socialism. There was party rule. And that's one of the major legacies it left. It not only left a legacy where there was no civil society, and there's practically no civil society throughout Eastern Europe today, it left a state that was gutted. There was nothing but a bureaucracy that had no sense of its professionalism or integrity. Same with the armies. So the consequences of this rule were basically extraordinary. The ethnic changes occurred primarily through World War II, although Stalin wasn't above manipulating the ethnic tensions in various countries for his own purpose. I say that if you look, Stalinism had two major effects. First, it destroyed any political realm with integrity of its own. No trade unions, no political parties, no intellectuals, nothing. And it absorbed them into one party polity, which no authoritarian regime has ever done. It made the public, the state, and the party one. Nowhere more so than in Romania, where they followed a policy of impletire, where you combine the state and... The second thing is they created ghetto societies. And I can't emphasize this enough. And if you look at the combination of Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev, what you find in all of these countries is they destroyed the ethical and moral basis of their population. They forced decent people to act unethically, illegally, in the black market, with shrodoviskas, with pile, with blat, with all sorts of things. And that led to fatigue and demoralization, and it led to the one thing ghetto societies have in Washington and in Bucharest, and that is a distrust and fear, an avoidance of the political, because the political is trouble. That's where you gain attention from somebody, and those people can hurt you because basically they're the police. There's an interesting facet about Stalinism, which in 1974 I wrote a little piece. God only knows how it got into the American Political Science Journal, because they'd never publish anything on an area study or dealing with communism. You had to have a diagram or an equation or some damn thing, you know. And I the only diagrams I knew were from English, you know, in high school, so I obviously wasn't going to work. So I did use the word variable. I thought variable would help me, you know. And I looked at political culture, and I wasn't really sure what a variable was, you know, independent or dependent. I always liked the notion of independence, so, but I came up with the idea that political culture was an intermediate variable, which confused enough people, you know, who were reading it, to be too embarrassed to say this is rubbish, and I got it published. It's just absolutely extraordinary. One of the things that Stalinism did, other than create ghetto societies, who had a fear and avoidance and a distrust of the political, which doesn't bode well for a country when it becomes independent later, because you have a legacy and a residue of distrust. And that exists throughout Eastern Europe today. That's why you get plebiscitarian leaders. You don't have civil association. People are afraid to combine publicly. Now, there are some people like Putin who make it impossible. But even where it is possible, it's very difficult. So you have ghetto societies. The other thing is you have no experience of political life outside of officialdom. It was the party who ran it. People didn't run it. And when you got beautiful, courageous, charismatic leaders, you know, like Michnik, whom I adore. I adore this man. Okay? I mean, any man who says, when confronted with the question, if you had to choose, what would you choose, Hitler or Stalin? He said, Marlene Dietrich. He refused to be put in a situation where I'm going to choose one of these. They asked him, they wanted to crush him. They asked him, what is worse about your going to jail? He said, it completely messes up my dating. There was an attitude of irreverence that took advantage of the lack of power. But the fact is, his charismatic ethical opposition, and the same with Havel's, is not an adequate base for an effective political constituency that endures over time. Charisma, by definition, is ephemeral and it's personal, and it's very rare when it creates a political organization, and it hasn't. It hasn't. So what you get is the absence of any genuine political realm that induces people to act critically, actively, vocally, vociferously, and believe that criticism of government is a natural and necessary thing. The other thing is, from the other side, this ghetto society reduces people ethically and morally, and they become scavengers of all kinds, scavengers. They don't trust anybody. They speak closely. Their only form of political discourse is rumor. In an environment where you have a domineering political regime and a ghetto society, the only thing that's able to connect the society to the regime, and that's necessary for it to persist, is rumor and dissimulation. Dissimulation becomes the major device for people subjected to arbitrary violence or terror. And as the regime proceeded, it went from terror to violence. The only way was to look as if you agreed. And that included people in the party. I went to party meetings in Romania. And I sat there and I listened to limba de lemn, wooden language. I mean, I saw intelligent people acting like jerks. Just jerks. And they were embarrassed. It was humiliating. And then they'd leave the party meeting and we'd go and drink, and you'd hear some of the smartest people in the world. Dissimulation is an effective means of maintaining obedience. And rumor is a pre-political way of trying to make sense of the environment you live in. And the more oppressive a regime, the more rumor you get. Yeah? If Romania under Ceausescu could have exported rumors, it would be richer than West Germany. And that is true in all of these societies. Well, the point I made that I thought was really brilliant, frankly, point I made was that if you look at Stalinist regimes, they unintentionally reinforce many of the behavioral and psychological features of the society they wanted to destroy. And that was a novel point. So along comes industrialization, which is supposed to replace agriculture, right? So, fine. How did the Soviets industrialize? The same way a peasant deals with the harvest. The harvest comes in, everybody works 18 hours a day for 3 months, gets it all done, and spends the next 9 months in a bar drinking coffee. At least the men. The women have to work. And then what happened with Stalin? In it comes. Now, industrialization, my father was a worker for 40 years in a wire mill, and let me tell you, you punched in at 5:30, you left at 3:30, and those machines were as regular as clockwork, and they were run by clocks. You go into a Soviet factory, which I did, or a Romanian factory, here's the first 10 days. Nothing's happening. People are coming in late. People are lazy, not much work, taking it easy. Next 10 days, Tolkachi start moving around, going out in their cars, getting the materials you need to fulfill an impossible plan in an impossible time. And then the next 10 days, all hell breaks loose. In fact, you wouldn't go in them. The rates of accidents were going up. Everything had to be done to either make or fake the plan. It was just like being a peasant. And who were the people in those factories? Peasants. That's what, they didn't import Scandinavian workers. These were people who had been in the farm 2 or 3 days ago. They had the same notion of time. Time wasn't regular. It wasn't an impersonal, measured discipline. The same with the economy. It wasn't methodical, rational acquisition. In short, everything that Stalin did worked against the possibility of when his rule ended that East Europe, and I don't care if it's Hungary, which was pseudo-Western, or Romanian, which was pseudo-Stalinist under Ceausescu, none of them were prepared to become Western in the sense of liberal, capitalist, legal procedure, none of them, or tolerant. Well, let me just make a couple more comments. East Europe didn't just live under Stalin. And the differences between Khrushchev and Stalin, Brezhnev and Khrushchev, are important. You can't understand the legacy of the breakthrough without understanding. By the time the regimes became extinct, Ronald Reagan was wrong. The Soviet Union was not evil. It was evil under Lenin. It was evil under Stalin. It was nasty under Khrushchev, and it was rotten under Brezhnev. And that's basically, and it was rotten everywhere. It was rotten in Hungary and Bulgaria, people trying to set their daughters up as their successors. The model was no longer Western Europe, it was Kim Il-sung. You had socialism in one family in Romania. They tried it in Bulgaria. There was nepotism in East Germany. The places basically had become corrupt inside. There was no party discipline whatsoever. By the end of Brezhnev's rule, you had 3 characteristics. The economy, and this was true of Gierek and everybody else, the economy was seen as a source of booty. There was no modern, impersonal, empirical base for that economy. Western aid was booty. You brought it in, you try to accomplish what you could, and then you try to get more. The party was parasitic. All the party did was wait for fealty, to have the farmers bring them eggs, to have the workers give them special gifts, to have the West send over a new Lincoln. And the people had become scavengers. Now you can say, this is a horrible portrayal. I lived in those countries, and there were decent people, and there were people trying to change, and they were Western-oriented, and you're absolutely right. And they were the minority. They were the minority. In every country but Poland, all the civic forces that existed, and they existed, were a minority. Now, by the end of Leninist rule, I thought that the outcome, put it bluntly, get to the end here. I thought that the outcome was a collage of horror. I couldn't find any sociological, political sociological. I couldn't find any ethical base at the mass or elite level for anything other. And this is what I predicted in Ivo Banac's book on Eastern Europe. I predicted basically an Eastern Europe made up of countries characterized by wildcat violence, insular suspicious social relations, weak counterfeit democratic states, isolated from their populations, and welfare clients of the West. That was my optimistic view. I figured that the closest East Europe would get to Western democracy was learning to play golf. One of the amazing things about countries that feel the need to change their identity is that it is very difficult to change your identity, but not your appearance. Thank you. And the appearance is very important. When the Visigoths came in and they saw the Romans, Claudius once said, you know, I think we've overdone our worry about these barbaric Visigoths. And so his aide said, why? He said, well, they've taken to wearing togas. And that means they're almost Roman. And if you look at Eastern Europe, I mean, as quickly as you could, you had senators and congressmen from the United States traveling. Every office I'd walk into had a copy of the Federalist Papers. The only thing lacking was a set of Callaway golf clubs. I mean, it surely can't be an accident that Saudi princes, Argentinian colonels, and Japanese businessmen play golf. They don't like golf. We play golf, and so they damn well better learn it because we can't play soccer. And that's what it comes down to. And my feeling was, with this legacy of horror, or basically of corruption, that there'd be no chance. And so I wrote that in the Leninist Legacy, and I was wrong. But fortunately for my own ego, I was wrong for exactly the right reason. What was it? I just said that I predicted, other things being equal, feeble authoritarian regimes would appear in Eastern Europe, and many, many, many people in my field predicted I was wrong. Some of them, David Stark and Bruce and other people who just had this utopian idea of a third way. The East Europeans were not going to be socialists. They were going to be not capitalists. The idea of a third way has a persistence that's beyond belief. It's never appeared. It's like the Holy Ghost. It's invisible but ever present in the mind of some utopian intellectuals. Other people said no. You know, they're going to make it, but they're going to make it over time and in their own distinct ways. And I said they weren't, unless. On the last page of the article, I asked whether, in light of the cumulatively negative Stalinist, Khrushchevian, and Brezhnevian legacies, if there was any, and I'm quoting myself, point of leverage to civic forces in Eastern Europe. They existed. They're just minuscule. Civic elite, urban, to civic forces in Eastern Europe that could check the increasing frustration, desperation, anger, and violence that would lead to country disorganization. And the center of all that would have been Hungary. And the reason is very simple. It had the largest diasporas. But it would have happened everywhere. It would have certainly happened in Romania. It tried to happen in Romania. It didn't happen. My answer was that there was a point of leverage to overcome these multiple interacting and reinforcing negative legacies, and the civic lever was Western Europe, right there on the page. More precisely, I argued that the only thing that can save Eastern Europe is adoption of Eastern Europe by Western Europe, which is precisely the path taken by the EU. Now, I think this qualifies as the most significantly benign event affecting Eastern Europe in about 400 years, and has allowed Eastern Europe for the first time in 400 years to become an effective part, if still tentative, of Western Europe. In the aftermath of the Leninist extinction, and this has a point particularly in relationship to the West. The West, in part, Bush and others, looked to Iraq and said, wait a minute, East Europe went democratic. All we had to do was lop off those communist heads, and those natural social forces, those natural civil societies, which I pointed out didn't exist, those natural liberal orientations, which I have argued didn't exist, gave rise to democratic countries. The only problem was that isn't what explains democracy in Eastern Europe. What explains it is that the EU, acting as Venus, not as Mars, came in and was benign. It was demanding in the criteria, in the acquis, and most countries, for the most part, adapted to them, followed them. You know, it's very interesting. In a book by Dobrogiana Guerra called Neobugia, he once said, maybe the best thing that could ever happen to Romania is if it becomes a province of France. And what I want to suggest to you is, with the EU, if you take the EU as France, And if you take Eastern Europe as Romania, that's exactly what's happened. Eastern Europe's become a liberal, democratic, capitalist part of Europe. The only fear I have is that unless that development is sustained and that discipline enforced, it will become Europe's ghetto. Thank you for your attention and putting up with my debilitated state. Now, there are probably as many disagreements as people. If you have any questions.
So Ken, let's take 15. Do you feel like taking 15 minutes of questions?
Yeah, I'll take questions.
Okay, great. Mark Kramer. There's a mic.
The question I have, I hesitate to deal with one aspect of it because it's such a sweeping talk, but I do think it touches on a larger point, which has to do with something you mentioned only in passing, but about Poland and the western part of it, the portion that had been former German territory. I wonder about that because not only were the borders extended, but there was massive ethnic cleansing that went on. Not only the expulsion of all the millions of Germans from that area, but then also Poles who had been expelled from Ukraine at Stalin's orders. A lot of those were resettled in that area, and the idea was it's quite clear from the deliberations about this is they wanted those people to be beholden to the regime, and including to the Soviet Union, for their security against Germany. And so even though I agree with you, I mean, it's interesting to think, Poznan, 1956, and as you say, Gdansk, etc. Still, that may have been some consequence of it, but I think it could easily have been, just in the way it was fashioned, it could easily have gone a much different way.
Okay. Let me suggest you're mistaken.
Keep the mic there.
First of all, there is absolutely no doubt that those people who moved into the Western territories were grateful to Gomulka and supported Gomulka. And, in fact, in 1970, went along with Gierek. So it's not a matter of them becoming automatic Jeffersonians. What I'm suggesting to you is that you had a population, how can I describe it in American terms? Go to an Irish pub as opposed to a Harvard restaurant. Most people at a Harvard restaurant have never had a fist fight. Nobody in an Irish pub has failed to have a fist fight. I mean, you just have to have a fist fight. Many people go for a fist fight. Now, there's a book which I'd recommend to you, and I don't recommend books, movies, or women, but I'm telling you, there's a book by Tomek Grabowski, Grabowski, which I beg you read. And it's about the Western Territories. And what happened in the Western Territories is that you had the development of what I consider to be the character-defining feature of Western civilization, and that's individualism, not, as Weber said, rationalization. And individualism is ego disciplined by conscience or some transcendental element. Ego is self-unrestrained, and the alternative is to derive your identity from a group, which is what people throughout the world today still do. We're the only individualist societies, Western, in the world. There are obviously corporate identities, it's not either or, but the dominant one's individual. The people that went into the Western Territories were physically rough. They committed crimes, they kicked people out of their land. This was just a rough crowd. And you know what happened? The Roman Catholic Church wanted to get hold of them. They didn't want them to become really good communists. And so the Roman Catholic Church became Protestant in Western Poland. It allowed for a greater role for deacons, for the laity, for participation, because these guys wouldn't put up with any of this mea culpa stuff. You had a tough frontier environment, and that's the only way I can put it. But you are absolutely right to add that these people were not adverse to the regime. The regime had given them their land. I don't think they were pro-Soviet, but they certainly were pro-Gomulka. And then they were pro-Gierek because he helped them with the industry and all the rest of the stuff. It really only broke down around 76 and 77. But I'm saying it is far from accidental. It has a sociological, social psychological base that this is where Wrocław and Szczecin and Sopot and Gdańsk, it was a purely Western phenomenon. Yes,
I'm
sir?
silent.
Yeah, Ken, a narrower question back to the original Stalinism paradigm laid out. Yesterday, John Connelly asked a question about when these East European leaders got together with the Soviets in this period and talked about democracy, about going slow. What did they mean? And I think you gave the answer. What they meant was democracy is loyalty to the Soviet Union. I mean, democracy is doing what's right for the Soviet Union. Is that accurate?
Well, let me just flesh it out. These regimes had support. I mean, the notion that these communist regimes, that there was 1,000 Romanian communists, many of them Hungarians and Jews, they're completely alienated from their societies, is not entirely true. No regime can persist over time without social support, information, recruits, resources. Kim Il-sung has support. That's just the way it is. You can't be one guy up there. So basically what you had, if you take Gilas's notion of the new class was the community that these people, whether it be Rákosi or whether it be Gheorghe or Beirut, it was that active plus Russia, plus the Soviet Union, which was their effective community.
You go there. Agnes Scheller.
Yeah, first of all, the caste. I think it was a very interesting comparison. In case of tradition, castes, those who dwell in the castle know they have a right to rule on the ground of tradition. The new owners of the castle have to prove that they have a right to rule, and they prove it not by the past, but they cannot, but by a future.
Right.
By a non-existing future, that is a great difference.
Right.
Question, and I would say that in fact I don't do a little bit neglect the role of mass psychology. By this I mean that fear creates faith, fear creates love, not only in the masses, but if a child is abused, this child might be in love with the abuser, and it is so in mass psychology. It needs to be taken into consideration that the exercise of violence of power can create fear, but the fear creates also love and creates also faith.
Right.
It creates a kind of pseudo-legitimacy.
I understand.
The third thing is about the West. I think, I don't think, but either way, my question is whether you mistake Western Europe for the United States.
What's it?
Because Western Europe is not traditionally democratic, with the exception of Great Britain. And even Great Britain is questionable in this respect. All East European countries knew about Nazism before they got to know communism. And this came from the West, from Austria, from Germany. And even France, you refer to France. It is true about the France of the last 40 years. But France was also Bonapartism, it was also Vichy, and these people in the East have experience from this kind of France. So, and of course Czechoslovakia was far more democratic than Austria and Germany before it was occupied by the Germans. So my problem is that you mentioned Western Europe as if Western Europe could be the United States, which are traditional democracies, or
Right.
the Western European states were only 4 years ahead
Right.
of us, Eastern Europeans, in getting used to a kind of democratic policy and democratic practices. The Germans know this well.
Thank you. This is the last comment because we want to stick to the schedule. Ken, please.
May I respond?
Of course.
Yeah. First of all, Professor Heller's notion that the castle has to speak to the future, I completely subscribe to. When I argue that many of the regime's actions unintentionally reinforced prior traditional elements, Even in the article I wrote, I pointed out that its self-legitimation was that it was going to create educated people, that it was going to tear down the Chinese wall between the peasantry and the working class, that it was going to create a modern technology, science, and working class, and even create a new socialist man. So I take that as a given. I have absolutely no argument with that. And in fact, as I said, if the article were here, you'd see that I had balanced the argument, not just in past. Now, the love thing I don't think works. The Stockholm Syndrome, where you're subjected to being taken by the Symbionese Liberation Army and fearful, and you end up being Patty Hearst and loving them, and taking a gun. That has to be done in extremely controlled, confined conditions. And that was something that Soviet-type regimes were not able to effect throughout their entire societies. It may have been true with certain limited groups, but as a whole, I think what mass fear did was lead not to identification of any kind, none, but to avoidance, to just mass avoidance. And furthermore, not just mass avoidance. I think one of the things that happened under Brezhnev that no one appreciates enough, first of all the regimes in Eastern Europe were Brezhnevian, all of them. They all were neo-traditional. They were all using Western aid as booty. They were all corrupt party cadres, and the people were all scavenging. And I think that left a residue of disaffection and, more than anything else, fatigue. I think fatigue is one of the great phenomenon underestimating what these regimes did to their people. I may be exaggerating my Romanian experience, but the exhaustion level and fatigue of having to live this way for so long, sometimes with heat deprivation, always with resource deprivation, always with worrying if you can maintain your connections, fatigue was enormous. People got sick of politics, literally sick. So if terror created fear and avoidance and secrecy and rumor, Brezhnev and his corruption just created cynicism, exhaustion, and fatigue. As for Western Europe, I think you're mistaken. I think that the identification with the West begins in the mid-19th century, not in the mid-20th century. And it occurred among elites, but elites count. They teach their students. And I think that with World War II and the Americanization of Europe, once again, the West became a major reference point. And largely because America did Americanize. It upgraded mass culture. It made equality more important than it had been in a very hierarchical European sense. I think the Americanization of World War II was a powerful impact. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ken. I'm not going to hug you now. I hug you yet.
Let's talk to Bogdan and racing back. Yes.
Coup d'etat here and take over the chairmanship a little bit and get us going with the session. But I will not do any introductions. You have all the information in the conference papers, all the biographical information. So we'll go straight in medias res on this panel on communist takeovers in East Central Europe with a talk by John Connelly from UC Berkeley.
I'm going to...
You can stay seated too.
Good morning. I want to first thank the organizers, especially Vladimir and Bogdan, but also the University of Maryland, the Romanian Embassy, the Romanian Cultural Institute. And special thanks to my alma mater, Georgetown University, where I was able to take courses with people like Jan Karski about 25 years ago, and also to the Wilson Center, where I worked as an intern for Timothy Garton Ash 20 years ago in the summer, and I was the one who told Ash, among other things, that Ronald Reagan had just challenged Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. We had different opinions of what that meant. And what I do today, I want to give a short overview of recent work on the German Democratic Republic, or as we used to say, East Germany. And then I want to explain, with particular focus on the early years, when it was in fact called the Soviet Zone of Occupation, how a society that supposedly had no Stalinism, or a very mild Stalinism, that's the reputation East Germany has in the scholarship, by the 1970s had the reputation of being neo-Stalinist. As we heard yesterday, some of the more influential work in the last few decades has called Stalinism in the Soviet Union a civilization. And of course, I'm referring above all to the book by Stephen Kotkin on Magnitogorsk. This book has had a revolutionary effect on Soviet studies by presenting Stalinism as a complete social and political world with its own values, codes, rituals, and above all, language. It was a sophisticated view in which social conflict was enacted through words and phrases that both citizens and state learned to employ and exploit. Questions of belief, that is, whether people really believed in the ideology or not, became secondary because the closed social system supposedly did not give people the language with which to express disbelief. But if we turn to Eastern Europe, we see that Stalinism was relatively brief, lasting only about 5 years. Too brief, I think, to justify the term civilization, that is, Stalinist civilization in Eastern Europe. And to my knowledge, Kotkin's vision has not been transported to studies of this region, although we learned yesterday that there are young historians in Hungary who find it interesting. We tend to use other words to describe the cohesive non-capitalist system that did emerge by the 1960s. Some call it state socialism. Some talk about dictatorship over needs. Others, Marxism-Leninism, or Ken Jowitt, simply Leninism. But this Leninism was not of one type. It was not uniform. There were important differences in application and important differences in outcome. Poland and Hungary evolved in the direction of reform, whereas East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania seemed to stagnate, and the regimes in these countries were overthrown in revolution. Some people took to calling these regimes neo-Stalinist. Yet even in this group, the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, seemed a special case. In 1984, the writer L.P. Morris wrote as follows: "Close party control over all aspects of national life was more systematically elaborated in the DDR than in any other East European state." And I have to tell you that when I was first learning East European history from a political scientist named Zvi Gittleman at the University of Michigan, we were told that there were two places in the world where the population had perhaps internalized socialist values. Those places were the Soviet Union and East Germany. I have to also tell you that Zvi Gittleman assigned us, I don't know if Ken Jowitt is still with us, an article, precisely the article that Ken Jowitt mentioned, the 1974 American Political Science Review article, which was quite a shock for a historian just coming from 2 years in Poland. But ultimately, I read and reread that very article, and it ultimately inspired my dissertation. But getting back to the issue of neo-Stalinism in East Germany, there's a historical problem with calling East Germany neo-Stalinist. How do you get to neo-Stalinism, that is, Stalinism without the terror, if Stalinism was brief, and according to accounts we have from specialists on East Germany and the Soviet bloc, including Zbigniew Brzezinski, relatively mild in the GDR? It is well known, for instance, that the East German Communist Party, the SED, did not subject itself to the self-immolation of parties elsewhere in the bloc. Forced industrialization was shorter and less severe, and there was no large-scale socialization of agriculture in the early years. Yet, and here I get to my critique of recent literature on the GDR, if you look at the work that has been written in Germany on the GDR in the last 18 years, you will not find an answer to this question. This, despite the fact that over 7,000 academic titles have appeared on the GDR, meaning that we possess more detailed knowledge about the GDR now than we do of West Germany, the former West Germany, or even the Third Reich, not to mention places like Czechoslovakia or Romania. I imagine it must be on the order of 20 times 20 times more information about East Germany than we possess on the other East European states. Why have historians of East Germany not addressed the question of how a neo-Stalinist society emerged in East Germany? At one level, this is because scholars have been consumed not by explaining how the GDR came to be as it was, but by characterizing it. In the last 15 years, most scholars working on the GDR have been involved in a debate over whether the GDR could or could not be called totalitarian. On the one side, interestingly and ironically led by former Trotskyists at the Free University of Berlin in West Berlin, there has been an insistence that the GDR must be called totalitarian. And one of these historians, Manfred Wilke, was in fact an advisor to the film Lives of Others, which you can actually see him speak on the recent DVD if you're interested. The other side, the opponents of this neo-totalitarian school, is far larger and consists of former East German historians, I would call them historian cadres, and West German social historians who have combined most impressively in Potsdam at something called the Center for Contemporary History. They call the GDR a modern dictatorship. And one of the most popular phrases they've come up with to describe the GDR is Wohlfahrtsdiktatur, a welfare dictatorship. This is associated with Konrad Jarosz. As social historians, these men and women have resisted the idea that any state could fully control citizens. But the problem in the GDR for social historians was that the state appeared over 40 years to control the historical narrative. There was no mass act of resistance in the GDR after 1953. So, how does one write history about a people who appeared historically irrelevant? The answer has been to employ a new term conceived by the anthropologist Alf Lütke to describe what supposedly was really going on in GDR society. If not resistance, then there was something going on that he has called Eigensinn. Eigensinn. It's a German word that means something like stubbornness, but it's not meant to mean simply stubbornness as used by analysts. Instead, he takes the two words apart, Eigen meaning own and Sinn meaning sense, to suggest something like people making their own sense of reality within East Germany. And of course, if you take that understanding of what is relevant to study, you can find Eigensinn just about everywhere. You find, for example, workers grumbling under their breath or decorating their workplaces as they like. You find people making interesting ways of making their Trabi look individual. People usually painted their Trabi, the small East German car. They painted it. They put specially designed cushions in the back. People spent hours in their garden houses telling jokes. These are the kinds of things that have attracted historians' interest. But the irony is that long after totalitarian theory was considered dead in the West, and I was told actually by my advisors in 1982 at Georgetown that it was not a direction to go in. I was interested in comparing East Germany to Nazi Germany. I was told that it was a dead subject in 1982. The students of the GDR have in fact resuscitated, and especially in negating the totalitarian theory, have perhaps made it more relevant than it's ever been since the 1950s. But to get back to historical scholarship, if you put the GDR in comparative historical context, that is, within the context of the Soviet bloc, was Eigensinn, was people making sense of their own lives, that which most characterized the GDR? Was Eigensinn the thing that impressed visitors from other East Bloc states when they visited the GDR? Or was it things like the following? The unusual proliferation of all kinds of uniforms, proudly worn, the uncustomarily efficient border controls, the pervasiveness of propaganda, middle-class-looking people proudly wearing party insignias, the sterility of offerings in bookstores and theaters, the strict limits of Western music to 40% of what any radio station or club could play, the guards in red armbands stationed at the front of university premises to keep out outsiders, the tendency of train passengers to leave the compartment if one tried to discuss politics, the difficulty of bribing taxi drivers and restaurant maitre d's, let alone state functionaries. I have to confess that the visitor from the East Bloc in question is not fictional. It was me, once a student of history in Poland in the early 1980s who used to like to visit the GDR. Most shocking for me or at the time, I should say, most revealing for me was a visit I had with a family in 1982 near Jena, and the daughter arrived home for lunch announcing that they had a fabulous new German teacher in her class. She was going to high school, the so-called Erweiterte Oberschule. And so we all wondered, how could she tell so quickly on the first day of class that this was a fabulous teacher? And she told us that she had opened class, this teacher, by saying, Guten Tag. That was the evidence. Why was that evidence? Because the normal thing to do when opening a class was to not say Guten Tag, but to say Freundschaft. And so she knew immediately that there was something different about this teacher. Now, as a historian, you have a choice. You can say, what a tremendous case of Eigensinn on the part of this teacher. Or you can ask, what kind of society is this where the simple act of saying hello has become a revolutionary event? Or in the case of the film I've referred to by Donnersmarck, where a good man is a man who refuses to snoop on someone else. Yet instead of investigating how the SED reshaped language and behavior, social historians have followed the lead of Alf Lütke, whom I've mentioned, who himself has followed the lead of Joan Scott, the American historian, in declaring that there is no reality beyond language, and that, quote, linguistic representations of reality have their own dynamic. I submit to you that to imagine language as sufficient to itself is an extraordinary act of solipsism in a part of the world that has brought us the Stasi. And here I have to again refer to my own experience, which has created my own bias. Visiting this family once again near Jena in the same year, I boasted to them at one point, I was actually sitting with some of them in a small Pfarramt, in a small church apartment in the middle of nowhere in Thüringen, in Thuringia, far from any city. And I boasted to the pastor, the Protestant pastor who was hosting us, and he was renowned as being a kind of a peace pastor and an opponent of the regime, very independent man, very charismatic man. And I took a moment unwisely to boast to him that I was, in fact, fooling the state, that I was fooling the Stasi, that I had booked a hotel room about 60 kilometers away, and then I had made it seem as though I was staying in the hotel room by rustling the sheets, and the like, and then leaving the hotel room and then actually going and visiting people so that they wouldn't know who I was visiting. And he looked at me right in the eye, this pastor, steely blue eyes, and he said to me, "Glaub mir, John, sie wissen genau, wo du bist." He said, "Believe me, John, they know exactly where you are." In the middle of nowhere, and suddenly, although we'd been drinking all evening, I was completely sober. So what is the moral of the story? 4 years later, I went back to visit this family, and that man was no longer in the GDR. In fact, he is the German aufgeflogen. He was, in fact, leading a small group of theater students, and at some point he had gone too far and been exposed as himself a Stasi agent. Subsequently, he went on to work as an editor for the conservative press in Germany, the Springer Presse. It's another story. People often ask what I think of the film Lives of Others. I usually say that I think reality was in fact worse than the film suggests. If you remember the party scene, there was this one supposed dissident who kept provoking this one theater director to admit that he was in the Stasi. Komm, du bist doch in der Stasi. So, because he couldn't explain how such a man with no talents got to be a theater director. In real life, it would have been that man who was the Stasi agent. Precisely the man provoking the others to say he was in the Stasi would himself have been the Stasi agent, and so on. So I think here we have partial explanation why this film has been so popular, because it examines questions that have almost been ignored by professional historians. Just briefly, I want to consider why historians have failed to think of the GDR as a dictatorship of the kind I was suggested. I think part of it is the rush to the completely open archives, in many cases by underemployed West Germans and unemployed East Germans, without first examining the literature on this subject. The second thing is to assume simply that this is the German context and it needs have no reference to any other context. The German context is sufficient to itself. The irony here is that people involved in studying the German context, precisely in a time when historians are supposedly going beyond the national context, have done less than a national context. East Germany was not a nation, after all. And furthermore, these historians have resisted seeing East Germany in the context of all German history. They refuse stubbornly to compare it to Nazi Germany, believing that if you compare something, you're saying something is like the other thing rather than trying to find out why it was different. So there's a very shallow understanding of comparative history in this milieu. A third reason, I think, is that social historians often sympathize with their subjects. The idea is to tell the people what their history was, to return history to the people. And of course, it's not nice to tell the people that they may have been homo sovieticus. I think the sympathy has gone too far. And finally, I think postmodern approaches that are fashionable and or perhaps less fashionable now than in the 1990s have biased researchers against historical explanation. People who try to explain historical outcomes are often accused of teleological thinking or of imposing closure upon processes that have no clear ends or beginnings. The overall result of the scholarship has been a kind of methodological but also historiographical solipsism in which stories lack meaning because they lack context. So what I try to do in the long paper that I submitted to the conference is to explain how East Germany in its socialist context became the regime it became. I draw attention to the factors that distinguish the case and that did so from the very beginning, that is precisely from the time we tend to think of as Stalinist, 1945 to 1956, especially 48 to 53. In these formative years, I argue, the SED created the soundest foundations for Leninism in the East Bloc. And I have 7 parts of my explanation. I don't know how much time I have to talk about them. But the first, Ken Jowitt likes 3, I like 7. Another Christian option. The first is the replacement of elites. I argue that the most complete exchange of elites took place in East Germany because nowhere else had elites been more delegitimized than in Germany. Although it's true, for example, in Poland that pre-war elites were subjected to a physical destruction unknown in Germany, many of the surviving elites, and I study this in my book on universities, emerged from the war morally invigorated. They felt invigorated because they could claim and did claim that they had led the anti-Nazi resistance. The East German elites had no choice, on the other hand, but to submit to humiliating denazification measures. And I show in my book how the exchange was the most complete anywhere in the bloc. Second reason is what I call the creation of a mass party and later a mass cadre party earlier than anywhere in the bloc. This is because of the Social Democrats. Excepting Slovakia, where Social Democrats merged with other anti-TISO forces during the wartime, the joining of the SPD and the KPD in April 1946 to form the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, was the earliest such merger in Eastern Europe. In other states, Social Democrats and Communists would not be joined for at least 2 more years. While it's true that after 1948, former Social Democrats were increasingly purged from the SED, in the early years, it was former Social Democrats that permitted rapid construction of the foundations for socialism in East Germany. They gave the KPD personnel with which to carry out its policies. And then when the purging began, interestingly in East Germany, the numbers of the party stayed relatively high because as the East German leadership purged former Social Democrats, it introduced new cadres into the party, so that what you have is a large party of relatively committed cadres by the early 1950s. The third thing that I look at and think distinguishes East Germany is the direct Soviet presence. There were Soviet officers elsewhere, but there weren't as many elsewhere as in East Germany. And this is perhaps even more important than the early creation of this large political organization that I mentioned. It's true that the SMAD, that was the Soviet military administration in Germany, did not intend to transfer the Soviet system to East Germany in the early years, and we talked about that yesterday, that there were, in fact, directives that it should not go too quickly. But its understanding of the Potsdam Accords and the 4 Ds, do you remember the 4 Ds of the Potsdam Accords? Democratization, denazification, demilitarization, decartelization. Its understanding of the Potsdam Accords tended to foreclose alternatives to Soviet-style socialism, even if the word socialism, not to mention Stalinism, was carefully avoided. For example, democratization of the justice system, the police forces, public administration, or education meant the introduction of members of the party which by definition represented the interests of the majority of the population, the most democratic party, the SED. Success in democratization could be measured by the degree of SED domination in any given area. Democratization never meant anything which opposed SED policy. The fourth reason I give is the party itself and its its character as a cohesive Leninist organization reflected in its failure to reform, an inability to reform in the 1950s. You could argue that in East Germany there was the greatest pressure for reform in this period because it had an open border. If the party didn't reform, it lost citizens. Yet what you find, in fact, if you look at the policies of this period, is the consistent refusal of the Ulbricht regime to imagine reform, and anyone in the party who talked about reform, especially after Stalin's death, being accused of wanting to engage in what they call discussion of mistakes. And the slogan became keine Fehlerdiskussion. So anytime 1956, 57, the supposed dissidents in the party wanted to oppose Ulbricht, they were accused of engaging in a discussion of mistakes. And interestingly, and I could talk in detail about these opponents of Ulbricht, whose names are well known, Herrnstadt, Seiser, etc. What really, and the philosophers, Harich, etc., what really is interesting about them in comparative context is just how little cohesion they had, how difficult it was for them to imagine any real resistance to the party. And here I think we have an explanation in the realm of culture. The SED was an organization that dated back from the early Social Democratic Party of Germany, which itself, under persecution, was organized like the Prussian army. And it had the kind of cohesion and discipline of an army. My fifth explanation is also in the realm of culture, and I talk about this in my entire book on universities. The SED was more determined than any other party to create a new elite using education. Education was a method it understood how to use and used very consistently, and you see this also in the film Lives of Others. There's this case in which a woman is looking through the peephole and sees that there's this Stasi team putting bugs in this apartment, and the Stasi, I think he's a captain, notices somebody's looking through the peephole, knocks on the door and says, if you say anything to anyone, your Masha is going to lose her place at the university. And this was used incredibly effectively by the SED at all levels. And I could talk in detail about that. Really, from the very beginning to the very end, education was used as a very precise tool to control behavior. The sixth thing is the open border to the west, which ironically was not a problem but an opportunity in the eyes of the SED. That is, it was a way of getting out people who were not satisfied with this illiberal system that was in the making, so-called bourgeois philosophers and historians. Anton Ackermann once said, when a physicist or a doctor leaves us, we're unhappy, but if a reactionary philosopher leaves, then we smile. And this was an opportunity that the party pursued for about 15 years. Over 15 years, there was a social selection of society in East Germany whereby people who did not want to live under that kind of regime could leave. The implication being that those who remained behind, even if they didn't necessarily like the regime, at least didn't rate what we might call liberal values so high compared to other values that they felt greatly dissatisfied. And after the wall was built, as we know, the regime continued letting out its dissidents, dumping them essentially in West Berlin. The seventh thing is anti-fascism, one of the most important things. We talked about legitimation. East Germany was the place where anti-fascism, beyond all other legitimating methods, had the strongest force in all of Eastern Europe, because East Germany was a state that had emerged from Nazi Germany. It was a place where the fascist legacy was most troubling, and where a guilt complex was strongest in the young party cadres who themselves had been members of the Hitler Youth, the German Army, etc. It had incredible force till the very end. So I think in conclusion, what I've hoped to show is that, what I myself have learned over the years is that social scientists seem to create ideal types. We historians tend to show that these ideal types never could exist. But the case of East Germany seems to come closest to the ideal type that Ken Jowitt talked about this morning. I also hope to have shown the power of direct comparison, not to try to prove or disprove any grand theories, but simply to identify historically relevant and interesting questions. Thank you.
Good morning. First, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. And it's not a sort of a casual or to be nice kind of remark. Rather, I feel grateful for an incentive to go back and revisit some of the things that I was thinking of when I was growing in People's Poland, and also to reconstruct in this context a number of conversations that I had with people who were both victims of the communist regime and those people who were the victors, so to speak, part of the existing communist structures. So it offered me a unique opportunity to do some things that I would not be able to do on my own because of my busy schedule, and in a sense it was a very intellectually rewarding period of working on this paper. I cannot guarantee the quality of the final paper, but I would like to make a couple of comments. The long paper written together with my brother, with whom I share some memories from the Stalinist period in Poland, and my memory which comes to my mind is that of being asked by our parents to go to the window and look whether somebody was. We were living in a small village outside of Warsaw, whether some people were not passing by who could report on my parents that they were listening to Radio Free Europe, and also to Voice of America, and especially I sort of remember in my memories there are sort of I still hear the voice of Mr. Światło, who defected in 1954. So, but interestingly, my sort of journey back to the communist takeover of Poland took me in a different direction. It took me rather to look at international ramification of the whole issue, and sort of very quickly decided that Poland is a unique case for a variety of reasons. Number one, it was a part of the winning coalition from the very beginning. In fact, the war started because of Poland. Number two, the war was triggered by the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and which was based on their both dissatisfaction with the order that emerged after the Versailles Treaty. Both countries never accepted the existence of Poland, including Germany, I was surprised to learn by going back to various books that even during Weimar time, that in Rapallo, I mean, the question of eastern borders of Germany were never fully, Germany did not accept, left open the question of their borders with Poland, and also that already there were some preparations going, some meetings, etc., which with the Soviet Union concerning the future to what both the Soviet and German propaganda referred to as the bastard of Versailles. So the paper, I mean, let me say a couple of comments about the paper, and then share with you what I learned from this exercise. Perhaps for many of you, I mean, especially for historians, there may be nothing new in it, but I think it's worth revisiting. The paper sort of so therefore the paper starts from the observation that Poland's communist takeover was the longest one. That essentially formally it started in 1939 with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and it was sort of very interesting to reread secret protocol of this pact, and which is referred to as the forced partitioning of Poland. So therefore, it has some very interesting implications for any assessment. I mean, the collusion of these two monsters have some very interesting implication for any assessment of the policies pursued by the government in exile, meaning that essentially in the war in Europe were on both, with Poland being squeezed between two totalitarian regimes, both of them bent on the destruction of the Versailles European order. Poland did not have any chance at all. Poland, so no matter what policies the government would pursue, it would always produce negative outcomes. There were no positive outcomes in this situation. So you could have minus smaller or minus larger, but anything, whatever they would do, it wouldn't matter much, given the structural conditions of the time. Number two, it's so the pact started. I mean, the first phase was sort of quite interesting to watch Stalin waiting for 17 days before attacking Poland. Stalin was convinced that France and Great Britain, after declaring war on Germany, would start some military operations, especially France. And he knew very well that practically Hitler did not have any soldiers left in western parts of Reich. Therefore, he waited until October 17. And in this way, I mean, after the taking over of the areas assigned to Stalin by the Ribbentrop-Molotov Treaty, the first stage of the communist takeover in Poland started. That is, 40% of the territory of pre-war Poland was taken over, and the process of so-called revolutionary changes started, meaning that people were sent to gulags, meaning that people were deported to various parts of the Soviet Union. So the second phase of the communist takeover started with the Barbarossa operation, when the Barbarossa operation started with the attack of Germany on Poland. It's also sort of interesting to see how Stalin's strategy evolved, and also it's quite interesting to conclude a conclusion which I didn't specify in writing, but which strikes me as a very sort of fundamental one, is that Stalin's obsession with Poland. Stalin clearly saw that gaining control over Poland and not the variant of Finlandization, gaining full control of Poland is critical to achieve his goals. And he, just to illustrate this point, in December of 1941, during the height of the greatest battle of the Second World War, the Battle of Moscow, as Andrew Nagorski argued in his recent book, Antoni Eden finally arrived to Moscow after a long trip. He has a meeting with Stalin, and Stalin had one document, and this document was described as sort of a draft of a treaty, treaties that would govern wartime cooperation between Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Another draft, a little bit shorter, which described post-war cooperation, and then he surprised his interlocutor with another document, a secret protocol, a secret document which he said, well, this is kind of arrangements that we would like to have after the war. And Curzon line was mentioned over there that essentially during that meeting he already requested that the partitioning of Poland as stipulated in the secret protocol should be recognized also by Great Britain. So can you imagine the situation when you have one of the first meetings, Germans are about 20 miles or 30 miles from Kremlin, you can hear the noise of troops fighting, and he already thinks about post-war order, and Poland is very much at the top of his list. Professor Edward Lipinski, who was one of the founders of CORE, Committee of Protection of Workers, a very well-known person in Poland. He was a mentor of my brother, and he told him that one of his friends, Stanisław Szalbe, was a member of the first delegation, one of the first delegations that visited already People's Poland, that visited Stalin. And Stalin, in his first introductory remarks, said that Poland was the largest trophy, was the biggest trophy for him of the Second World War. Another item that I found very interesting was obviously the question of why was FDR so accommodating to Stalin's demands, and the paper sort of tries to explain it. Number one, it started with an observation that really there were no, increasingly as the war unfolded, there were no big three, there were big two. Great Britain was clearly marginalized, and I was trying to find the explanation why Churchill never came to FDR's funeral, and probably this cozy relationship described in one of the books that I quote here, this cozy relationship, I mean, very nice intellectual relationship that they had before, came to an end as the war progressed. I think that what strikes me, I mean, the paper reviews various explanations, but I think that probably the most important, the most convincing explanation why sort of so easily, I mean, accepting, sort of the loss of 40%, the effect of the Soviet aggression, the loss of 40% of the territory, etc., why it came so easily to allies with whom, I mean, Poland had the fourth largest army fighting during the Second World War in Europe and Middle East. I mean, about 7,000 soldiers, made enormous contributions. And I sort of read recently, I mean, the documents prepared by the commission, I mean, historical commission, Polish, British historical commission. And so a number of references demonstrating that Poland's contribution to intelligence at that time were just enormous. Enigma project and number of their success in deciphering German codes and etc. Not only limited to Germany, but also operating in other countries. One of the Church's secretary mentioned that Poland was really number one in terms of providing them with intelligence information. So why FDR? What is the most likely? And I think for me was the most convincing explanation. The most convincing explanation is FDR's vision of the post-war world. I know I'm an economist from the economic perspective. I know that the idea of Bretton Woods, started immediately after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Morgenthau was instructed to start working on the shape of post-war economic arrangements. And I know that we know that also the idea, at least this is the argument made by Henry Kissinger in his book Diplomacy, that the idea of a world run by four powers, members of the Security Council without France, that was the idea that he had of the post-war world. In order for that to happen, these countries had to have their spheres of influence, and Poland, in this respect, had little geopolitical value. Obviously, there was also the argument of what was going on the war at the war theater, as the fact that for Stalin, soldiers was the most expendable resource, in contrast to FDR or Churchill. But and on top of everything, that you had a very favorable climate of approval. I mean, the approval ratings for Stalin in this country. I remember reading somebody's memoirs that, a refugee from the Soviet Union, that he was surprised that in the 1940s that Stalin was much more popular than he could remember Hitler. That he can remember he was in his own country in the Soviet Union. So So it's sort of access. I mean, I found it very, very interesting and to observe, how basically the Stalin was in charge of everything. He would dictate the terms of meetings, dates of meetings, places of meetings. I mean, and then at the same time, FDR was trying to do everything that was possible to avoid Stalin's dissatisfaction. Tehran is a good example of that. When there, I mean, FDR refused invitation of Churchill to stay in the British embassy. He refused to meet him in private, and he made it. Well, he made the trip, whereas Tehran is very close to the Soviet Union. Now, going to Stalin's strategy and how he operated. Well, number one, certainly the physical elimination of political class, pre-war political class, was on top of his agenda. He started doing it in 1939, 1940, and then he continued doing it indirectly by allowing the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, by allowing Germans to quell it, and then allowing them to try to erase Warsaw from the map of this world. So I guess I have 3 minutes, so let me move to the Soviet Union. After the elimination of the political class, Stalin faced the challenge of creating political class that would serve his goals in Poland. So here, I mean, there were some very interesting steps. Number one was to parachute 3 communists into Poland, and which were subsequently a conversation of many, topic of conversation of many conversations among Poles in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Mołojec brothers, Paweł Finder, Marceli Nowotko, they were all, I mean, somehow they all sort of disappeared. One Mołojec killed Nowotko, and then subsequently, with the assistance apparently from what I've been reading recently, from Władysław Gomułka, they killed another Mołojec, and then Finder was rather mysteriously denounced to the Gestapo, and then arrested. So Troika disappeared. Nevertheless, the progress was with the establishment of the Communist Party, which was the original Communist Party and most of its members. It was a marginal organization of Poland, but they disappeared in gulags in 1938, 1939. So the next step was, so on the one hand, we had this attempt to create a communist political party, recreate communist political party in Poland, and then at the same time, I mean, in Poland under German occupation. And then at the same time, there was an attempt to establish political structures in the Soviet Union. So it started with the Union of Polish Patriots, no mention of communists in the name of the organization. Stalin's protege and confidant Wanda Wasilewska became the president of this union. Then gradually, I mean, as the Soviet army progressed, new structures, and there's a detailed description of them, emerged. What is interesting here is, I mean, what is interesting is that the communist takeover itself follows a very similar pattern as in other countries. I mean, this stage when you had the Soviet army over there, when essentially the communist future or People's Poland was a done deal, that then the strategy pursued by the communists was similar. What I found interesting is that from the materials, I mean, here of the Woodrow Wilson Center, the notes, the text of Andrzej Werblan and the notes of Władysław Gomułka from his conversation with Stalin was that it was Stalin who insisted, who sort of pushed Gomułka to have elections as quickly as possible. And his argument was that if you wait too long, Poles from England and other places will return. And number two, the economic situation will deteriorate, and therefore it may become much more difficult to do anything, to win the elections. But obviously, Stalin knew that winning elections was simply a matter of who controls the counting process, not really how people are voting. And here, I mean, Gomulka, probably impressed by the results of elections in Hungary, of Smallholder's victory, argued in favor of doing it a little bit later, and that's the course of action which was adopted. I'm afraid I have to end at this point, but just to final observation is that the fact that you had this long assault on long conquest of Poland, that you had a well-organized underground society, and in spite of the fact that political class was destroyed, nevertheless, I mean, communists had to. It was not a castle in the sense that Professor Jowitt was arguing, because from the very beginning, communists actively sought legitimacy. Just a final example, I mean, Bolesław Bierut took lessons from a famous Polish actor to speak beautiful Polish. That was, I mean, he didn't, if he was just a guy from the castle, he wouldn't care. And number two, if you look at the reconstruction of Poland, reconstruction of Warsaw, reconstruction of many historical monuments across Poland, including churches, then I don't think that the Communist Party of a castle mentality would act in this way. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Ekaterina Nikova from Bulgaria, and I also feel obliged to start my speech with expressing my most sincere gratitude to the organizers, Vlad Tismaneanu in particular, and the Wilson Center, in which I spent one happy year in the early 90s, when things looked so much easier, except for the Yugoslav war, of course, but Eastern Europe and even Russia seemed to be heading in the right direction and in a good speed. I'm here to give an account of the new way that we in Bulgaria are looking at Stalinism. Like elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the term Stalinism is new. We used to use the euphemism cult of personality. The period is now extended to include the years 1944 up to 1956. What happened in 1956 was that a legendary April plenum of the Bulgarian Communist Party broke decisively, as it was called, with the cult of personality, and took solemnly a new line, which is even more legendary, called the April line, which was to last for the next 30 years. Stalinism was replaced by Živkovism, because Todor Živkov, a rather grey second echelon figure, was headed the Bulgarian Communist Party, and he himself used the exposure of the deformities and deviation of the cult of personality to legalize himself and to establish himself as the leader of the country and the party. Generally speaking, the period of Stalinism was dealt rather parenthetically in official Bulgarian historiography mostly as an unpleasant and embarrassing incident. In general, it was believed that the communist takeover in Bulgaria was accomplished much earlier and was milder, and Stalinism at all was milder than elsewhere in Europe, Eastern Europe. Explanations were sought and found in the traditional leftism of one of Eastern Europe's most leftist egalitarian countries, in the relative strength of the Bulgarian Communist Party, but first and foremost in the historical friendliness to Russia. Grandfather Ivan, who fought the Russian-Turkish War in the late 19th century and liberated Bulgaria from the Ottoman Empire. In the late 70s, carefully selected historians were given the possibilities to work in the party archives on carefully selected topics from the period of Stalinism. Some of them did produce remarkable books. Some of them were published before, but most of them after the changes in Bulgaria. I should mention at first place the biography of Traicu Kostov. Revisiting Stalinism, however, in the true sense of the word, could happen only after 1989. We were not that fast in opening the archives, although a lot of them have been declassified and restructured. The problem with the opening of the archives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs has been solved only recently, and the first name that popped up was the president's. So you see, it's this explains the foot dragging on the issue. In the last decade, we've seen a true avalanche of important new books, memoirs of people from both sides. We've seen an avalanche. Is it working? I'm not sure. Okay. So we've witnessed a true avalanche of important new books, memoirs of people from the both sides of the barricades, the political figures and the victims, although sometimes they exchanged places. Diaries, lots of diaries, including the very important diaries of Georgi Dimitrov, biographies, etc. Local district archives are proving to be a real golden mine, which is only now beginning to be explored. In general, we can say that the period is now pretty well illuminated. Did we learn things that we didn't know before? Were there any great surprises, any dramatic reversals of historical truth or fallen idols? The answer is close to the negative. In the light on Bulgarian Stalinism could put the period in its proper context, and things could be called by their proper names. What is probably the biggest surprise, and it was really a shock for the Bulgarian society, was the scale of the murders and repressions in the period 1944-1953. Speaking of the shock, I can tell you the story how in the early 1990, when the first democratic elections took part in the country, a French advertising guru came to Bulgaria, and he used in his overall very professional, very cheerful campaign a map of Bulgaria dotted with little skulls which showed the places of the almost 100 concentration camps from communist time. The shock of this map was so great that it was later believed that it had cost the opposition about 10% of the votes, which meant also the overall electoral victory. Now we know much more through the dry language of the militia reports and the historical memories. And now it is very difficult a decade later to imagine that how the Bulgarian could believe that communist takeover was met with mass enthusiasm and only negligible resistance. Numbers are notoriously unreliable, but I could say without any exaggeration that the picture of these years is truly horrifying. There were waves of terror which came one after the other, as if following Hannah Arendt's scheme, or should I say, the scheme of the Grand Terror of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the first 10 days of the communist takeover, between 25 and 30,000 people were killed or disappeared. Some of them were police and army officers, mayors and clerks responsible for the persecution of the anti-fascist resistance. But the majority were mayors, lawyers, journalists, teachers, clergymen, or just well-off, outstanding figures in their own town villages. Later, a minister of the Interior would boast that they had a norm, 3 peasants in every village. There were about 5,000 villages in Bulgaria at that time, which means that 15,000 peasants, well-off peasants, were murdered. There were spontaneous acts of revenge and class hatred, yet the scale cannot be ascribed only to a revolutionary fury. We know now that these purges, and the Russian word čistka appeared very quickly and was adopted in the Bulgarian language now, those čistki were aimed mostly at the annihilation of all eventual potential class enemies. And this was, we know, a well-guided spontaneity. We know one part of, we don't know what instructions came from Moscow, but we know what the Central Committee, most probably this was Traicu Kostov himself, were reporting to Moscow, that is to Dimitrov. In the first, and this is the text of a telegram, which interestingly were written in Russian. In the first days of the revolution, we squared accounts with our most malicious enemies. The fight is not over. Armed members of the party and Komsomol will form striking commands for particularly important assignments. 2 weeks later, on October 1st, the Central Committee reports, despite the discontent of our feeble allies, these were the agrarians and the Social Democrats, at our revolutionary liquidation of the fascist Agentura, we decided that the purchase will go on for 1 more week. After that, they asked permission for 1 more week, and then we can continue by lawful means. There are eyewitnesses who claim that these revolutionary troikas had lists. And so, as I said, the spontaneity was very well orchestrated. In October, just 3 weeks after the takeover, under the insistence of General Biruzov, the deputy chairman of the Allied Control Commission, a decree was passed which established the People's Court for the trial of those accused of monarcho-fascism, war crimes, and collaboration. The People's Court in Bulgaria set a true record, I think. I'll just give you the number. The People's Court tried 135 cases against 12,000 defendants, of whom 2,730 were sentenced to death. Proportionally to the population, and I think in absolute numbers, they are unprecedented in European practice. It is clear now that the court and the spontaneous purges managed to decapitate the pre-war political, economic, and cultural elites. and virtually destroyed the old center and right of Bulgarian politics. Then came the turn of the opposition within the Fatherland Front. By March 46, Stalin was losing patience. A second Fatherland Front cabinet was formed without the representatives of the opposition. The elections are over, he said, and your opposition can go to hell, he said to Dimitrov. The trials against the social democratic leader and the agrarian leader took place. The army was spared until 46. Later, mass purges among the officers were carried out under fabricated accusations. Thousands of victims, family members were expelled. Bulgaria was one of the first, actually I was told second after Albania, to organize labor camps, the so-called work education centers. The exact numbers of the people passed are still a question of war. The war of statistics goes on, but it is considered the numbers are between 25,000 and 185,000. Then followed the so-called democratization of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, then the purges among the Bulgarian Roman Catholics and Protestants. But the most serious challenge to the Bulgarian Stalinist hegemony presented the Bulgarian National Union. Solidly based in an egalitarian peasant society, the Great Agrarian Party, with its long history, ideology and leaders, was by far the country's most numerous and organized political force and an formidable opponent. In this respect, the political situation of Bulgaria was quite unique. The agrarians, which is more important, were able to contain the rising revolutionary tide after Bulgaria's defeat in World War I. In the early 20s, they ruled the country for 3 years. In the late 30s, they managed to regain their important role in Bulgarian politics. After the communist takeover, it is well known how the membership of the Communist Party grew in an explosive manner, but it is less known that the membership of the Agrarian Union, which was restored at the end of 1944, grew even faster. By the end of the same year, it amounted to almost 1 million people, 750 in the union itself and another 250,000 in the youth organization, while the communists at that time were 250,000. There was another anomaly compared to the other East European, and particularly Southeast European parties. The Bulgarian communists, although they had a good record in the resistance movement, this record was incomparable to the record of the Greek or the Yugoslav comrades. So they were much stronger in the 20s and in the 30s than in the 40s. And there is also there was never a strong distinction in the Bulgarian case between domestic and Moscow communists, because most of the Bulgarian communists at one point had been to the Moscow Comintern or KGB schools. The strength of Bulgaria's anti-communist opposition, an opposition gathered around two mass left-wing parties, I think is unique and unrivaled in post-war Eastern Europe. And they fought courageously for almost 2 years, from September 1945 to August 1947. This opposition kept on fighting against all odds, hoping that with the peace treaty and the withdrawal of the Red Army, they could take the upper hand. And there is no doubt that had the terms of the game been equal, the agrarians would have prevailed. The crushing of the agrarians marked the beginning of Bulgaria. It happened, first the day. So I think that in the Bulgarian case, the periodization should not be Shklarska-Poremba or even Stalin-Tito split. It was the day of the ratification of the the peace treaty with Bulgaria. That same day, the Bulgarian agrarian leader was was arrested and later sentenced to death. And the rank and file of the big agrarian union followed was sent to the Bulgarian Gulag. Then came the purge in the party, as the usual practice was. And the question here is, the question here is, why so much violence? Bulgaria was, after all, a country which had managed to stay away from the cataclysms of the Second World War. It never sent troops to the Eastern Front. It managed to preserve its 50,000 Jewish population. And on the day that the king was dead, it was happened in August 1943. As we now know from the diary of Hitler's minister to Sofia, all the country wept collectively, hysterically, which was a sign of a peaceful and very, I should say, coherent country. The Soviet army, when they entered the country, experienced a kind of a cultural shock, which is very well described in the works of a Soviet writer, Konstantin Paustovsky. They've never seen such a prosperous, quiet country, smiling people, meeting them with bread and salt. And a government which was very well inclined to the Allied Commission. So the question, why so much violence, I think is exactly in this peaceful character of the country before the communist takeover. When the first purges started, the agrarians ran immediately to the communists and said, "What are you doing?" And Traicu Kostov, who would be sentenced to death just 3 years later, he just shrugged shoulders. He said, "This is a revolution." And that's the problem. That was the problem, that there was no revolution. A revolutionary